How are we dealing with the Ukraine crisis? How has the government, the media, and the opposition responded to it? That is the question we need to answer. Because, make no mistake about it, the Ukraine crisis is the most urgent crisis of our times. It has the potential to bring about a tectonic geostrategic shift in policy making. And it has the potential to impact us in a big way in both financial, military, and even cultural terms. We cannot close our eyes to it and pretend it is happening in a faraway place and is of no concern to us, except perhaps in overseeing the evacuation of Indian medical students from that part of the world. The fact is, this crisis will wobble old relationships, perhaps create new ones, and force us to reassess our priorities and our place in the world. That is why we need to understand how we have dealt with this issue so far. But all that in a minute. First, let me welcome all to the CAA show. CAA, as all of you know, is Conversations and Analysis. My name is Juggi Bhasin. The CAA show is the Thinking Folks show, and we invite you to be a part of it. All you have to do is to press the subscriber button on your screen. Subscription is, of course, completely free. So let us first examine how the government has dealt with this issue. To understand this, we have to know the cultural and historical significance of our response. The fact of the matter is that culturally, despite all the contradictions, we are closer to the United States and even to countries like the United Kingdom. We share common democratic values with them. We have families and friends over there, and we do like to visit these countries for holidays and work. And yet, at the same time, if you do a snap poll, then be sure of the fact that even today, and despite the growing closeness of Russia with China, Indians by far still trust Russia to come to their rescue in times of conflict, and even voting at the United Nations on sensitive issues like Kashmir. So, we carry this contradiction in our hearts. This conflict of interest is unique and unparalleled anywhere in the world. It is the type of contradiction that is not fully understood by the liberal woke community, both in India and abroad, and certainly not by commentators like Fareed Zakaria, who have been urging India to completely get on the Western bandwagon and cast its lot there. The government knows this, and it realizes that the sky is the limit in terms of our relations with the United States. But the old Russia connect is too potent, too comforting, and even too valuable in many senses of the word to be discarded in an instant by an act of Russian aggression. The contradictions and conflicting nature of the present conflict, that is also very much apparent to the government. Nobody in their right minds can defend the Russian attack on a helpless, innocent Ukrainian population. And simply on the pretext of denazification of Ukraine, that kind of reasoning does not wash with anyone. And yet, at the same time, if we look at the situation from Russia's perspective, they do have a serious and legitimate concern that the West has brought NATO right at their doorstep. And it not only endangers the territorial integrity of Russia, but encourages more and more regions in that country to break away from the Russian Federation. And the contradictions continue to abound. The valor of the ordinary Ukrainian and even its President Zelensky has already become the stuff of legend. But it can be argued, should not Zelensky have been more caring by negotiating a ceasefire rather than asking his people to pick up arms and resist, which in my opinion was completely needless, because that can only result in more and more killings. And from our point of view, the racist behavior of Ukrainian guards in offloading Indian students from trains and putting them in harm's way, and even as reports suggest of using them as hostages and shields against advancing Russian troops, leaves a bitter taste in the mouth. So, in the light of these contradictions and fast-changing situation and managing the delicate task of pulling out all our students from that place, the government by far has done a really good job. It surely deserves an 8 out of 10. As one commentator put it, only Modi could have persuaded the Russians to suspend their attacks for 6 hours to enable Indian students to get safe passage. And how did our opposition respond to the government's efforts? And did our media step up to the task? I'm afraid both entities let us down immensely. Was it not incumbent on the opposition to understand the tightrope walk undertaken by the government, caught between the West more than subtle pressure to side with them and condemn Russia? Does not the opposition know that if we sever our links with Russia and condemn them, it could take months, if not years, before 60% of our weaponry purchased from Russia can be replaced? And if the answer to that question is a yes, then at what financial and territorial cost? Will the Chinese and the Pakistanis wait for India to replenish its depleted weaponry before infringing on our territory? If anything, this crisis was an occasion for the opposition to stand firmly with the government and its middle-of-the-road policy. Keep at bay the so-called liberal voices amongst us challenging the government's Ukraine policy. Instead of that, Rahul Gandhi, Chidambaram, Shashi Tharoor, Mamata Banerjee have been criticizing the government from the rooftops. The opposition then, therefore, in my opinion, gets a 4 out of 10 for their sheer irresponsibility. And our media also, I'm afraid, fares no better. The real story for the media in this crisis was the plight of the Indian students trapped there and the plans for their safe evacuation. And in that respect, not even one channel has stepped up to the task. Headlines today did manage to send a senior news person, Gaurav Sawant, in that part of the world, and look at what he ended up doing. He spent most of his time in some nondescript place with no sign of activity around him, making us aware he was in mortal danger. That was not the story. I am not interested in the macho posturings of news persons of, oh, we are surrounded by gunfire and sirens are going off, and parroting lines taken straight from the BBC and France 24. If I wanted to watch that kind of a story, I will tune into France 24 and CNN. I am interested in our media persons reaching the bunkers where our Indian students are taking shelter. I am interested in interviews with them, the hardships they are facing, the racial discrimination they face as they try to board trains to flee the war zones only to be thrown off trains by racist Ukrainian guards. I was interested in reports that should have understood the irony of history that Indians have faced over the years. Gandhiji was thrown off the train in South Africa by a racist train conductor. And generations later, the same mentality exists when our helpless, fearful, terrorized Indian students were thrown off trains by racist guards. Not one news person thought of this angle and compiled such a story. Not one report was filed of the sheer terror of leaving bunkers and underground shelters to come out in the open, to buy food and perhaps face a sniper's bullet or a misdirected shell. The sheer terror and agony experienced by the students did not come out in a single report. All we had were anchors and reporters of our channels parroting the same lines, showing the same visual, transmitted 100 times by Al Jazeera, BBC, CNN. And while of these foreign channels, let me say that I might have my strong reservations of these channels in the manner they depict India, but one cannot fault them in the slightest how and with what depth they showed the narration of war. The BBC's Least You Said on the night of the missile strikes on Kyiv was in an underground shelter filled with medical supplies and soldiery which was on the hit list of Russian missiles. CNN's Matthew Chance was right next to Russian paratroopers who landed at an airstrip and were preparing to storm it. These reporters know the story they are chasing and what they want to put across. Like us, who are busy reporting from irrelevant locations, producing useless content. In fact, the Indian medical students who crossed over to Poland and Romania did a much better job of recording amateur videos and transmitting them, which highlighted their agony and harassment than any so-called professional coverage of our news persons. And the same story unfolded in our newsrooms. No one bothered to get backgrounders from the ministry showing the number of times the Russians pulled out our chestnuts from the fire when it came to voting in the UN on sensitive issues like Kashmir. No one bothered to understand what really it is that the West wants in this conflict. No one cared to file stories that if we side with the West, what intangible terms will it cost us in military and financial terms? And I have yet to see a story that if the West can combine so effectively and ruthlessly on sanctions, can they not do the same in the future against India on the issue of Kashmir if we fail to toe their line? In pure reporting terms and in preparing backgrounders, our news persons failed in their roles. All we have are anchors using the world event for more and more self-projection and scoring political points in whichever ideology they believe in. So, newly rehabilitated NDTV anchor and Harvard return Nidhi Razdan keeps questioning each guest on our program of how far the government has failed in handling the evacuation and abstaining on the UN vote. The story for her is not the Ukraine war and the dilemma which India faces. It is all about leading the guests to criticize the government for their inept handling. And then on the other side of the divide, you have the Times Now anchor Rahul Shivshankar, who uses this crisis to self-project and keep talking non-stop of stuff no one understands and cares about. Fact is, all across the board and either side of the ideology divide, the media has failed to not only bring home the story of this year, but more perversely buy into somebody else's narrative and start towing somebody else's line. Make no mistake about it. The Western media, for all their emphasis on freedom of choice in reporting world events, always toes their country's line and are almost like an embedded arm of their government projecting its narrative. We, on the other hand, use every major event to not only miss the boat, but start adopting somebody else's war and cause as our own and washing our own political dirty linen in public using world events as a backdrop. So the media, like our opposition, gets a 4 out of 10 in the present crisis. That is from me. Things, of course, could still change in a fast-changing situation. The government could commit a blunder, or maybe some of our media could step up to the task. Anything is possible. Because only in a crisis, the real iron in one's soul, or the lack of it, clearly shows up. And so on this note, I come to this rather longish episode of the CAA show. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you like our show, please do subscribe to us. And on this note, it's goodbye and cheers from my end.